Hello everyone, welcome back to the Racing Writers Podcast. I'm your host, Kelly Crandall. Got a fun episode for you today. I was joined by longtime NASCAR writer Deb Williams to help me break down and put a stamp on the 2017 NASCAR season, and boy did we cover quite a bit of topic. I love talking to Deb. She has been a great friend to me since I came into the sport a few years ago and is always there to talk racing or just have an ear when I need it. So I was very happy to get Deb on the podcast and really pick her brain about what we saw in 2017. So you're going to hear us talk about Martin Truex Jr.'s championship, what kind of a champion he'll be. We break down stage racing, what we're looking forward to, what we saw this year. And from there, we just kept going on and on and on. One of the things that I really wanted to talk to Deb about, though, because, again, she has been in this sport and covered this sport for quite some time and really has such a well-rounded view of anybody in the media center. So with the big news of Dale Earnhardt Jr. retiring this year, the main purpose for me was to really kind of get her to reflect on what kind of a person Dale Earnhardt Jr. is, his career, looking back on whether or not we were surprised at this announcement, and of course talk about Matt Kenseth, kind of how his tenure with Joe Gibbs Racing ended. So a lot of topics were covered, as I always say on this podcast. That's what I'm here to do. And again, I was really excited to have Deb Williams get together and do this podcast with me. So that is this week's episode. Again, some housekeeping notes. Keep rating, reviewing, leaving messages on social media. I see them all. I appreciate them all. I had told you last week that this week's episode was going to be Erik Jones, but as you can see, I'm kind of switching some things around. So to put a bookend on 2017, I have Deb Williams this week. Erik Jones will air. Perhaps I'll do that next week, or again, I'll skip a week and go after that. You know, this is my podcast. I'm just going to keep jumping around and kind of fill the weeks here as I see fit, and kind of see if we're hungering for some NASCAR content, and it's going to dictate what I do with this podcast. But I do have Erik Jones in the can. I've also am going to at some point air an interview that I did with Joey Logano way back in the spring of 2017. I did it at Bristol. We were looking ahead to his 300th Cup Series start, and I got about 30 minutes with Joey, and he really opened up about his career coming into the Cup Series, what a welcome back to earth moment that was after all the success that he had in other series, certainly in the Xfinity series, and then coming and jumping into a Cup car, and really, it wasn't easy. And, we talked about that. He opened up about when all of the rumors started that he was going to be out of a ride at Joe Gibbs Racing before he landed at Team Penske. And so, Joe, that interview that I want to air is because I walked away from that interview, and as I've said a few times on this podcast, that was one of the interviews that I looked back on and said, man, I wish I could air the audio of that. So I do want to air that, mostly because I want everybody to hear from Joey himself. I know I wrote a story on Racer.com for it, but I want everybody to hear from Joey himself what, just in 300 starts these last couple years, what it has been like for him to really grow up in front of the cameras, to go through struggles and success and everything that he's already had at the Cup Series level. So we're going to air that at some point during the off season. And I still have in the can a conversation with Pat Suey from Chevrolet where we break down the Chevrolet Camaro ZL1, which is going to debut next year in the Monster Energy NASCAR Cup Series. And I wanted to talk to Pat because everybody wants to know, how is this car going to work? How is it going to be better for Chevrolet teams? It looks good, it looks badass, but what is it going to do on the racetrack? So I've got that coming as well, and we're going to try to keep moving along here during this off season before we get into the media tour, which is almost now just a little over a month away here in Charlotte, and then before you know it, we're going to be in Daytona for Speed Week, and we'll really start to hopefully get rolling with guests again. So that's what I've got coming down the line. Again, we're just going to keep it going, see what we got. But this week, a very fun episode with my friend Deb Williams. I appreciate her coming on. I appreciate her taking the time. We had tried to get together on a few different occasions before we finally got to sit down earlier this week and record this podcast. So here is Deb Williams on the Racing Writers Podcast. And again, I hope you enjoy, and please spread the love for Deb, for the podcast, and I hope you enjoy. So here is this week's episode of the Racing Writers Podcast. Oh, well, my goodness, Deb Williams and I are here. And Deb, we've already been talking for, 30 minutes off air, just about everything, as we normally do. But thank you for, we finally get to do this. I'm very excited. Deb Williams currently of RacingToday.com. So I'm very glad that we were able to finally do this and help me put a bookend on 2017.
And thank you for having me, Kelly. It's a great honor, and I'm pleased to be with you. And yes, 2017 is definitely a memorable year.
Yes.
Not only from Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s final season, But the changing of the guard as it continues, and stage racing. I think a lot of people were very apprehensive about stage racing when it began, but I think it's been very good for the sport, and I think it's brought an element of excitement back.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on probably a bunch of those topics, but first, Deb, I know a little bit of your history in the sport. You have been around for many years, seen many things, covered many different drivers. So just for the listeners, if you want to give a little bit of your background, not only of your currently of racingtoday.com, but I know you were at NASCAR Scene, which I was a big subscriber of, and I know many people recognize that. So if you just want to dig into kind of where you've been throughout your career.
Okay, well, thank you. Actually, I've been around the sport my entire life. I grew up around it, and it's like I always tell people, Mother and Daddy were going when Mother was pregnant with me, and the first year of my life, the only place they could get me to quit crying and sleep was in the infield at the dirt track under the loudspeaker at the old Asheville-Weaverville Speedway. I'm sure a lot of people remember that track, which, of course, unfortunately no longer exists. It's now the site of North Buncombe High School, just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. But, I decided at age 13 I wanted to be a sports writer, preferably a motorsports writer. And that's all I really wanted to do. As I tell people, I love fast horses, fast cars, but fast men make me nervous. But,
I like that.
But, I love high-performance vehicles. I always have, and sports cars. And, of course, the big thing when I was growing up, was the Daytona 500, the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the Indy 500. And I was fortunate enough to be able to start covering short track racing when I was still in college at what was then known as New Asheville Speedway. It's now a state-designated historical site on Amboy Road, thanks to the Biltmore House wanting to get rid of it so it wouldn't interfere with their hotel guests across Interstate 40. But I went from there to United Press International, and when I went with United Press International, when it was still a true wire service going head-to-head against the Associated Press, is when I started covering NASCAR more so on a full-time basis and Cup. And then when I left UPI, I was a reporter and researcher for the first year of the inaugural show Inside NASCAR.
Mm-hmm.
And then
I remember that.
And then went from there to Griggs Publishing when Griggs still owned what was then Grand National Scene, and then it became Winston Cup Scene, and then it became NASCAR Winston Cup Scene. Yep. And I was there for 18 years, and the editor of Scene the last 10 years I was there. And since then, I say I've required my motorsports education because I worked for Roger Penske for 4 years. Yeah. And that I worked for a team, and then I worked for the old Hooters Pro Cup Series, handling PR for that series, and then ran the media center for Rockingham when Andy Hillenburg reopened it.
Oh, wow.
And also handled the PR and press relations briefly for historic North Wilkesboro Speedway when it reopened. So that's why I say I received my motorsports education over those 10 years after I left Scene, because I worked for a team, I worked for a series, I worked for a track. And it's giving me a lot better perspective of the sport and an understanding of different facets of the sport that I didn't have when I had just been a reporter of it.
Yeah, I was going to say, you probably, of anybody in the media center today, have a very well-rounded view of all areas of this sport.
I think so, and that's why I say my motorsports education occurred. And it's interesting because there are columns I look back on now that I wrote when I was at Scene that I would not write now, or I would write differently. And the prime example is I wrote a column when we started having the sanitization or vanillization of the drivers. I wrote
which is always a fun topic.
Oh, it is. But I wrote the column criticizing NASCAR for sanitizing the drivers. Well, after working for a race team for 4 years, I learned it wasn't NASCAR that's sanitizing the drivers. It's corporate America that's sanitizing the drivers because they don't want to lose market share. They don't want to lose customers in the marketplace. And they're concerned that if their driver starts a big rivalry with another driver or makes that driver's fans mad, they're going to lose them in the marketplace. So
it's all about that sponsorship.
It is, and it's all about selling the product and
we,
getting your return on your investment.
And that's something, again, that we seem to continuously talk about. It seems like year after year. So, Deb, let's start with, given your background, let's start with somebody that you have covered since his start, which is Dale Earnhardt Jr. Of course, we all followed his appreciation tour this year, which started the second half of the year. He started getting gifts and visiting the media center. But I'm just curious, first off, going back to when he announced his retirement in April, I believe it was April 25th, were you surprised by that, given everything that had happened coming into this year with the concussions and how hard he fought to come back? And then 3-4 months in, he turned around and says, you know what, I want to have a life away from racing. Were you surprised that this was his last year?
No, I wasn't. And I wasn't because of seeing how much he has matured and has changed as a person, and how that concussion syndrome affected him. And he wanted to be able to enjoy life, and he wanted to be able to have a family. And I think in the back of his mind, he did not want to put his children through what he went through in losing his father. And I don't think a lot of people realize how long it took Dale Jr. and his dad to get to a comfortable place with each other. They don't realize that when Dale Jr. and Kelly, his sister, were children, they basically had each other because their parents divorced when they were quite young. And that's why he has always put so much trust and so much faith in Kelly, is because Kelly took care of him. And when his father sent him to military school, Kelly went as well because she didn't want him up there by himself. And, you know, I remember him when he was a boy around the track with his dad after his dad got custody of him and his sister before he ever married Teresa. And he had the attitude, oh, I can do anything because Dale Earnhardt's my daddy.
Yeah.
And then I would...
Which I guess you can't really blame a kid for.
Probably not. But it was funny because to see his maturity level now, and he is like his father in helping people, but other people not knowing about it. His dad was very good at helping people, but he didn't want the rest of the world to know it. And I have seen Dale Earnhardt Jr. start doing that, particularly people who are severely adversely affected by concussions, whether it be an 11-year-old girl or even Michael Orr, who people probably remember from The Blind Side.
Yeah.
And it's been neat watching him mature, but as he was driving his final race at Homestead, I couldn't help but think back to the year that he won his first Busch Series championship there at Homestead. I happened to be staying at the same hotel where his team and he were staying in Key Largo. And they partied all night long after that because I was up most of the night writing in my room, and you could hear them across the pool in the way partying. And of course, when one place shut down, they just moved to another place.
Right.
But what was funny about that, he had to leave early the next morning to go to a commercial shoot that he and his dad were doing. And of course, his dad had the helicopter fly in to get him. So you could hear the helicopter coming in and landing. And I don't think Dale Jr. had been to bed that whole night. So I've always been real curious as to what his dad's reaction was when they got to the site for the commercial shoot. But it's been nice watching him mature and develop other business interests outside the sport. You know, I don't think a lot of people know he has his own entertainment company, and has for many, many years, called Hammerhead Entertainment. It's a video and TV production company.
Yeah. I mean, he shares a little bit on social media of when they're, you know, maybe the Xfinity teams are doing photo shoots or something. He'll say, we're at Hammerhead today. And I think some people may have started to kind of associate that word with the company, but yeah, for some people they may not know that's actually his company. So you mentioned the relationship between Dale Jr. and Dale Sr., and a lot of us have heard, and maybe for the younger fans, have heard Dale always talk about, I miss having him around because we were just starting to get to know each other, and that's what you had said.
Mm-hmm.
Take us back to what was that relationship like before Dale Sr. passed? How long did it take for them to really get to a place where they were comfortable with each other? And why was that, you think?
I think a lot of it was because Dale Earnhardt had a rough life growing up. He had to make it taking out 30-day and 60-day and 90-day notes, bank notes. So he had to drive like he did to make the money to pay the bank. And he worked on his own cars. And, Dale Jr. and Kerry and Kelly, none of them had a silver spoon mouth.
Contrary to popular belief.
Exactly. And, Dale actually got full custody of Dale Jr. and Kelly before he ever married Teresa. And he was tough. He had told Kelly she couldn't go out and date anybody unless he met the boy first. And as Kelly says, that was hard to do since you date on the weekends, and her dad was always gone racing on the weekends. So when Dale Jr. and Kerry were racing late models, they lived in a mobile home together. And Dale Jr. was racing at Myrtle Beach, Kerry was racing at Hickory, and Kelly was racing at Tri-County. And so they were all on different tracks. And, I think a lot of the issues between Dale Jr. and his dad was work ethic. Because Dale was always up at 4 and 5 in the morning, and he worked the farm. And Dale Jr. was sleeping till noon.
Yeah.
He'd be up partying. And there was one time we were running Darlington, and Jr. apparently didn't think his dad was going to come back on Saturday night before the race on Sunday. And he was having a party, and they heard the helicopter coming in. And everyone started fleeing out of the house and jumping in their cars and driving off. But, I think that was the big thing. And it was really, unfortunately, probably the fall of 2000, before we lost Dale in February 2001, that it's like Dale Earnhardt told a reporter, Sandy McKee with the Baltimore Sun, he was at a good place in his life because he had put his family back together. Mm-hmm. He had Kerry. Kerry was using the Earnhardt name and had come back. And, of course, he did that when he was 18. That was done, he lost the Earnhardt name through no fault of his own, but he took it back when he was 18, and Dale was very happy about that. And Kelly had just had her first daughter, and the family was back together, and Dale was very, very happy about that. And I think that was the place that he and Junior had just started being able to communicate with one another.
So it was right before Dale passed.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's why we always hear, Junior talk about, we had just really started to kind of get to know each other and to bond, and we were in a good place, and then he was gone.
That's true.
Do you feel like with Dale's passing that that's kind of, I've heard this before, I'm just curious of your take, do you feel like that's when Dale Jr. really became a man, so to speak? Losing Dale Sr.? The way it's always been said to me, and you watch all of these different documentaries and different interviews, and I forget who said it, but somebody had said that when Dale Jr. left Daytona after the Daytona 500 in 2001, that by the time he got back to North Carolina, he was the man of the household, and he just knew he had to grow up, essentially. Did you see that from him?
He did, but he still was grappling with it. He didn't know who he was.
Of course.
He had to figure out who Dale Earnhardt Jr. was. And I know, and I think we've all done it. Mine was when I went to college, and I had to determine what my beliefs were, what my parents' beliefs were, how I felt about certain things. And I think suddenly that was thrust upon him in that now he's expected to be grown up. He can't be the party boy that just has a good time anymore.
Yeah.
And but he was still grappling with his identity, his own identity of who he was.
Right.
He was not, and that was hard for him because so many of the fans wanted him to be Dale Earnhardt.
Right.
They had trouble accepting that this is Dale Earnhardt Jr., and I felt sorry for him because I think in a lot of respects his name was a hindrance for him. It may have been a problem in him being able to grow up and form and find his own identity.
Right, and do it his way.
Exactly. And I think that's where Amy has been so instrumental. You know, Kelly did everything she could, and she was always right there for him. But, you know, he needed someone else, too, to help that he could trust. And those are the two people I think he trusts the most, are Kelly and Amy. And that relationship with Amy, I think, has just been wondrous for him because he has become comfortable with who he is and his own identity and stopped trying to live up to what people wanted him to be.
It's taken a long time, but it really feels like he personally, as his dad once said, he's in a good place.
He is.
And now he's going to have his own family,
yes.
which it's going to be very exciting to watch.
It will be. And, you know, I have to admit, that was why it didn't surprise me when he said that was going to be his last season and why he took the step he did. Because, like I said earlier, I don't think he knew he wanted to have a family.
Yeah.
He did not want to put his children through what he went through. And he wanted to take that step. He was healthy. He wanted to be at a place where he could enjoy him. And I know that was one thing when Ernie Irvin had his severe head injury that I used to pray for, was that he would be able to enjoy his children.
Right.
And enjoy what they did and their accomplishments and everything. And, you know, I think that that's what Dale Jr. was looking at, and he felt comfortable with his decision and in a comfortable place in his life. Just like his father was at that comfortable place in his life in the fall of 2000, and Dale Jr. is now at that comfortable place in his life.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Deb. When you look back at Dale Jr.'s career, as well as everything he's done for the sport, which I know many people like to take into account as well, will he be in the Hall of Fame?
I think he will be eventually one day.
I'm not saying anytime soon, but I'm just saying,
No.
will there come a day where we say Dale Earnhardt Jr. NASCAR Hall of Famer?
I think so. But I think one thing that may keep him from going in very quickly is the fact that he did not win a Cup championship.
Yeah.
But he did win Busch Series championships.
Yeah, back to back.
And he sure did. And, you know, unfortunately, you have some people on the NASCAR Hall of Fame voting panel who are not familiar with the history of the sport. And they want to look strictly at a person's wins and championships, and they don't know what was entailed in a particular area and what the person had to deal with and what effect that person had on the sport.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing that's very sad about that voting panel.
I sit here and nod because I had heard something, just as a side note, talking about the Hall of Fame, of why Alan Kawicki is not in the Hall of Fame. And just hearing some of the discussion of what, I'm not on the voting panel, but in hearing some of the stuff of maybe what had been discussed in the room, is that there's just a percentage of people who think that his off-the-track demeanor was too rough. And to me, I just don't think that should be taken into account for the Hall of Fame, but I guess that could be a separate conversation.
Well, I'm not on the voting panel either, but I can tell you that Alan, you have to understand Alan and understand his background.
Right.
I always said, if Alan could have kept a little bit of the personality that he got after he got a couple of drinks in him, people would have seen an entirely different Alan Kawicki.
Yeah.
Because he was hilarious. But he was an engineer. He had that engineer mentality. He had to make it a certain way. He had given his time frame to make it a certain way. And, I don't think people realize he lost his mother when he was 7 years old. His only brother was a hemophiliac and died at one of Alan's football games when Alan was playing football when he blew one of those horns, and it caused him to die. The man basically made his way. His dad did not want him going into racing. His dad remarried when Alan was 14, and Alan never really got along. They actually later resolved everything, and by the time he won the championship, and he was cool with Thelma, and who Jerry had married when he was 14. But Alan's mind was very, very calculating, and
he had a single focus.
And that
was to succeed.
Yes,
and I just brought that up because you were talking about the people in the voting room, and not to speak ill of anybody. I mean, that's a very tough job to do. But you had just talked about you had mentioned maybe some people in the room don't have a very good picture of the sport in general, and it made me think of that because I was very upset. I think I was listening to Nate Ryan's podcast. He was talking to Tony Gibson, and Nate, I believe, is on the voting panel, and he had said that without going into too much detail of what goes on in the room, that was kind of the feeling around an Alan Kawicki. And of course Tony Gibson had worked with Alan, so I was just, again, it's a separate conversation, but I was just really upset to hear that that's kind of what goes on in that room. Maybe
particularly for the people, I know who's on that panel because I see the names every time, but the bulk of them that are on that panel never knew Alan.
Right.
And yeah, he could be a little weird duck. I mean,
Like I said, it's a tough job, but it just.
His favorite TV show was Alf.
Yeah, that just took me back. Is there anything, before we go to another topic, Deb, is there anything personally in your time of covering Dale Jr. that stands out to you, maybe some interactions you've had or things that he's done in the sport? You actually mentioned he's like his dad, that he likes to help people, and I think that's what stood out to me this year with the whole appreciation tour, is that every time he came into the media center, he was always so excited, not because he was getting something, but of the tracks who did something in his name. I'm just curious, what are maybe a personal takeaway you have of Dale Jr.?
That is the biggest change that I have seen in Dale Earnhardt Jr. from the late 1990s till now, is how thoughtful he is of other people now, and how he cares about other people. He wants to help other people, and that's where I say he became a man and his maturity level occurred, because he's not the same person of the 1990s. He was kind of selfish back then, and he's not now. I don't think there's a selfish bone in his body now. Yeah. And just seeing what he does to help people, and that's what he told the tracks. He didn't want anything for his final season. He would much prefer them go out and do something in the community to help others. And I thought that was very noble of him and very great of the tracks that they honored his wish. And when you look at how many people have been helped now and will be helped in the future because of that, what a wonderful legacy that is.
Yeah. He's not the only one leaving, though. We've also talked this year about Danica Patrick wants to run the Daytona 500. Hopefully, we'll have to see if she gets a ride. And Matt Kenseth, the thing with Matt that has really kind of rubbed me the wrong way this year is he's not. And granted, not everybody gets to go out on their terms, but he did not at all seem happy with kind of how this all happened with Joe Gibbs Racing. And I know that there's a lot of people that are rubbed the wrong way as well, because it just kind of seems almost not fair in a way. And life is not fair. I'm not trying to sit here and say pity Matt Kenseth, right? But it just kind of stinks to me.
I agree, and I think my personal opinion is Matt got caught off guard. Yes. Just from watching him and watching his demeanor. And when you look back at the loyalty he had to Roush Fenway and Jack Roush, and he left there after years and years and years to go to Joe Gibbs because he felt he needed to win a championship. And to look at the stability, or I call a bread and butter driver. You know they're always going to do well. They're always going to get you a win or two. They're going to finish high in the points. They're going to make you money. They're not going to tear up your cars. And Matt has always been that type of person. And just watching his facial expressions at the banquet, you could tell that man was not happy. He felt he got shafted. And, quite honestly, as calm as he was about everything initially, I thought he was going to go into a third Cup car at Richard Childress Racing. Because he and Newman had been friends. They're wise and all. When he first came, they both came into Cup racing. They used to park their motorhomes beside each other. So because he was so calm about everything, I thought that's where he was going. And when that didn't happen, then I was very surprised. Mm-hmm. And, unfortunately, there was some driver, and I don't remember who it was, made the comment that the older drivers are losing their rides because the younger drivers are coming in for cheaper salaries.
That was Dale Jr., ironically enough.
Was it?
Yeah. He opened up a whole can of worms at Watkins Glen about contracts and younger drivers and all, yes.
Well, my comment to that is, welcome to my world. Because that is the real world.
Yeah.
And they're experiencing the same thing that so many race fans and even non-race fans go through every single day in their jobs.
It's very funny that you just said that Matt was so calm through this, really since July when he came out at Kentucky Speedway and said, I don't have a job for next year. Mm-hmm. And I remember it was Bristol in late August where I was talking to somebody in the garage, and I said the very same thing. I said either one of two things is going to happen before the end of the year. Either Matt is so calm because he knows what he's going to be doing for next year, in the sense of he's working on lining something up, or he's making peace with the fact that he's not going to race next year. Mm-hmm. Now, we just talked about how he's not happy about that, but he also admitted, I think it was at Phoenix, that he had started to make peace with the fact that he wasn't going to have a job for next year. And I just, again, going back to what I'd said earlier, it's very unfortunate because, speaking again of the Hall of Fame, I think Matt Kenseth's a Hall of Fame driver. Mm-hmm. But I also believe he could have stayed around for maybe another 2-3 years and certainly won more races. But at the same time, Joe Gibbs has to do what Joe Gibbs has to do, whether you agree with it or not. But I think the way, again, that it all unfolded is what kind of stinks about the whole thing.
I agree, and I've also wondered if maybe Carl Edwards' decision didn't throw a monkey wrench in a lot of things, because when Carl did what he did, it threw out what Joe Gibbs had planned, where Eric Jones was concerned and Daniel Suarez was concerned. So, I think that is another thing that you have to look at that probably adversely affected Matt Kenseth's situation. Because when Carl Edwards suddenly just walked out the way he did, that messed up the plan that Joe Gibbs had over there as far as bringing the younger drivers along. And I think that caused Matt to get caught, and he was a victim of circumstances.
Yeah, I can understand that. So let's jump more into the racing from 2017. At the top, you had mentioned stage racing. Mm-hmm. I loved stage racing. Mm-hmm. When NASCAR announced it in January, on paper it sounded great. Mm-hmm. Just from the aspect of, I loved how we were going to shake it up to where drivers weren't going to be able to ride around during the race. You were putting an incentive out there to make them go race hard. Of course, ironically enough, it worked out quite well for Martin Truex Jr. What did you see from stage racing in terms of, do you feel like it did what it was intended to do? And was it for the better from a racing perspective?
Oh, I definitely think it was the correct way to go. What I find interesting is that Martin Truex Jr. seemed to figure out so quickly how to make it work for him. And it seemed like everybody else was still floundering along, and they just didn't really understand it.
Which makes me excited for next year.
Yeah, it really does.
Now that they've all seen it.
Yeah, and seen how it can help. But it just amazed me that Martin Truex
one
Jr.,
guy.
that one person. And then even when we got halfway through the season, it was like the others. Hello, people. Are you not watching what Martin Truex Jr. is doing here?
I know, it's funny.
Does it not click with you?
It seemed like by the summer months, we the media all kept asking, do you feel like you're losing, do you feel like you're behind because you don't have stage points? Denny Hamlin and Jimmy Johnson were a few of the drivers that we kept hounding about that because they had very little stage wins and stage points. And you're right, everybody just seemed like they were acting as if it wasn't a big deal, as if they just didn't quite grasp the importance of it. And then by the time that we got right before the playoffs started and everybody started looking at kind of how the points were going to shake out, then it became a whole big thing that everybody suddenly was like, well, I need playoff points. So it's very funny, I think, that you say that. And again, it makes me excited going into next year of, now that everybody understands it, how will that change the racing again? Will it make people race even harder? And I understand they always tell us we're racing at 100%. But if you're out there and now you know how important that one extra playoff point is, I'm curious if going into year 2 of stage racing is going to make it even better than what we had this year.
I think it will. And, the other thing that I find interesting there is that did Martin Truex Jr. and his team grasp it so quickly because they're not here in the Charlotte hub? Because, let's face it, Furniture Row Racing is the first team not based in the Charlotte area to win the Cup Championship since the Elliots did it in 1988 when they were based in Dawsonville, Georgia.
Yeah.
And so, is that the reason nobody else was able to grasp it so quickly? Is because they're out there in Colorado and they're doing their own thing. And, I think that's a case of the rest of the crowd underestimating that team. They underestimated it tremendously. And I find that quite amusing as well.
I find it amusing because I recently wrote this for Racer.com. If you go back to 2016, there was a sign that this was going to happen. Because when Furniture Row and Truex got teamed up with Joe Gibbs Racing and they switched from Chevrolet to Toyota, he won 4 races in 2016. He led a bunch of laps. Remember what he did at the Coke 600?
Oh yeah.
So there was kind of like this. To me, that was a sign.
Exactly.
That when they get on the same page and they stop having all this bad luck, they could run roughshod over the series, and then wouldn't you know it, that's exactly what they did.
Despite so many distractions that they could have had away from the track. With Sherry having to battle cancer again and losing a team member to a heart attack, and Barney Visser having his heart surgery. But it was their year. And when it's a particular team's year.
Once in a lifetime, I feel like, type of season.
Yeah.
I mean, his average finish, I believe, was a 9.3. That's incredible for 36 races.
Most definitely.
And in the playoffs, I believe it was something, it was just under a fifth place average finish.
Something like that. It was phenomenal.
It's unbelievable. What kind of champion do you think Truex will be?
Oh, I think he'll be an excellent champion. For the simple reason that he grew up in the sport, but when you've wanted something for so long, you're going to be the best you could be. And I honestly think that he'll be a better champion now than he would have when he was driving for Michael Waltrip Racing. Because, like Dale Earnhardt Jr., he has matured. He has gone through other things in life that make you take account of what's really important and get your priorities in order and become very, very appreciative of things, and you don't take things for granted. And as you were talking about Kawicki earlier, one thing that Alan was very conscious about was being a good champion for the sport. He didn't want to let NASCAR down. He didn't want to let R.J. Reynolds down. And that was what he said at the end of his speech that night, was that he hoped that at the end of his year they would feel that he had been a good champion. And I think Martin Truex Jr. will be an excellent representative of the sport.
We've thrown out the word mature quite a bit the last few minutes. Personally, I feel like Kyle Busch has matured since 2005 when he came in. But 2017 for Kyle Busch was almost the year I felt like where he just did not care anymore. Whether it was Joey Logano or Brad Keselowski, if you said something he didn't like, he was going to tell you about it. Whether it was Brad and him, spouting off on social media about the Toyota advantage that Brad feels they have, and Kyle telling him to STFU, whether it was media day where he told, where he flat out said, hey, you just don't like a guy. And of course at Las Vegas where he marched down pit road and tried to go 12 rounds with Joey Logano. When you look back at 2017, is a guy like Kyle, did he make the year more interesting, or is that a bad look for the sport? Because some people would say we need rivalries, we need emotion. And we had quite a few of that. We could also talk about, there was Denny Hamlin and Chase Elliott at Martinsville. But Kyle, to me, really stood out because he was continuously just putting himself out there like, I'm going to say what I feel and I don't care. Is that a good thing? Or do you think it rubs the sport the bad way? Some people would say that makes us look like we can't control our drivers.
Well, first of all, the people who view that are not competitive. You have to understand the emotional level that these drivers operate at and these crew members. It's like I've always said, I know what a competitive person I am. And I know what I would do in certain situations. And I will never condemn a driver for doing something that I know that I would do if I was in the same situation.
That's an interesting way to put it. I don't think many people view it like that. I think they're just so quick to judge.
Maybe that's because they're not that competitive.
Or that. You're making me think now, Deb.
As my mother always said, there's a time and a place for everything. And the drivers always fought. The crews always fought.
Yeah, this is not a new concept.
No, it's just that there's always cameras there now. There's always social media there.
Yeah, I think you just hit it. Social media is what makes it 10 times worse.
Yeah, when I was growing up, Bobby Allison's crew and Richard Petty's crew were always getting in fights. When they would go on that northern tour after the July Daytona race, and they'd be up north for 2 weeks in Trenton, New Jersey, and Islip, New York. I always say I'm mispronouncing it. Some say Islip, some say Islip. Yeah. But they would be up there for 2 weeks, and there was no radio coverage. They were short track races. There was no TV coverage, no radio coverage. You were lucky if you got a 5-inch story in the Asheville Citizen 2 days after the race to know who won. And then there'd be in there, there was one place that Dale Earnhardt and Morris Petty got into a fight with Bobby Allison's crew, and they got fined and all. It's been the way it shucks. Back in the 50s when they didn't have guardrails at some of the tracks, they used to run them out of the track. They'd get into each other and run out of the track and come all the way around the back grandstands and come back in again.
Yes.
And that was how you man up, so to speak.
It is a contact sport.
Yeah. And, if this, to me, going at somebody on Twitter, and we had some of those issues this year, is really a chicken way of doing it.
That's an interesting way to view it.
If you're going to say something, go say it to their face, but don't hide behind a computer screen.
Right. Which you could also say, because we already have that with fans who want to go at the drivers. So if the drivers are going to sit back and say, well, you're a keyboard warrior, but they're turning around and doing the same thing to their competitors. That's very interesting. I get a kick out of Kyle because whether you love him or hate him, you mentioned the word competitive.
He's a well of a race car driver.
He is, and he is probably the most competitive guy off the top of my head that I can think of that we have in the garage right now. Second, it's just unacceptable.
That's right. And
so,
it's just like to bring Dale Earnhardt up again. And, he enjoyed that intimidator label. And he would. And he would try you. And I'm not talking about just drivers. I'm talking about media too. And if he found out he could intimidate you, he did it every chance he got. And if you stood up to him, he respected you. But if you let him run all over you, he did it every chance he got because he didn't have any respect for you.
Right.
And, you know, there's a right way and a wrong way to do something. And I'll have to admit, I've been bad enough that I wanted to hit some people. So, like
Once again,
I said,
you can't fault somebody for
doing something that I know I would do in the same situation.
Yeah, he's just so competitive that he's being genuine. He's not out there.
Exactly.
I remember those old commercials. I think it was Gillette commercials.
Same thing with Keselowski.
With Matt Kenseth back. They used to do these Gillette commercials, and they used to make fun of Matt Kenseth because they always said he was like a robot because he was just very calm and didn't kind of rub anybody the wrong way. And now we have drivers who are showing emotion, but once again, everybody wants to squash it.
Yeah, and I think another thing you have to look at too is how society has changed. You know, you got to remember that the people who founded this sport and the drivers who initially were in this sport had just lived through the Depression, the Great Depression, and World War II. And driving a convertible race car or driving out there the way they did and fighting the way they did, that wasn't any big deal. And in society, that wasn't any big deal then.
Toyota was clearly head above everybody else in 2017. Chevrolet, I feel like Chevrolet, they weren't terrible, but I feel like they also got to a point where they were like, okay, we know next year will be better because they have the Camaro coming. Then you look at Ford. Ford keeps telling us they have no plans to update their race cars. And you have Brad Keselowski over here talking about how, well, we're going to just keep getting beat. You know, we're so far behind, we need help. First off, can Toyota keep doing what it's doing?
Every time you have somebody get ahead, if you rest on your laurels, you're going to get beat. So it's a situation where I think Ford got caught off guard somewhere, because when we went to the press conference with Tony Stewart and Clint Boyer, and the way Ford talked and all, somewhere Ford got caught off guard.
That's a very good point. They were very, very optimistic.
And I can't help but wonder if maybe that isn't the reason there's been a change in the head of the Ford's Motorsports division.
Yeah.
When we went to that press conference with Clint Boyer and Tony Stewart and the Ford executives,
it was sunshine and rainbows, and we're going to be competitive.
Yeah, of course, it always is before the season starts with anybody.
Right.
But because of the season they had before, it made sense. And I don't know what Toyota did during the off season or what they found.
Remember they had that they rolled out their 18 Camry.
Right.
So you have Toyota. They obviously knew what they were doing with their car. And again, Chevy wasn't terrible, but Toyota brings out a new car. Of course, you expect it to be better. So I guess the question is, we expect Chevrolet to be better next year with the Camaro, and I'll have a podcast out in January talking to Pat Suey from Chevrolet where he breaks down how hard they worked on this car to make sure that it's racetrack ready. It was very fascinating to hear kind of how they worked with the downforce, because downforce, of course, is the word nowadays. So if Toyota is going to keep rolling as they're rolling, and Chevrolet is now going to have their new car, do we go into next year, Deb, and Ford is still struggling, as Brad Keselowski says? Or do we get to a point where next year Ford finally has to throw in the towel and say, okay, we're going to do something? Does it almost force their hand?
Well, my question there is, what has NASCAR changed on the rules?
Right.
So you got to look at what has NASCAR changed on the rules.
Because they keep tweaking,
right?
The undercarriage and things you can do there. And the heights of this and the heights of that. Yeah.
You got to look at that. We don't know what type of R&D that they're doing over at Roush Yates Engines. And then you've got to look at the new pit road rules for next year, because they've taken one person away. I've got to go back and look at some of my old copy, but I think we're back to the number of crew members over the pit wall now that were there when I first started covering the sport.
So we went from 6 to 5. Okay. Yeah.
And I think that's what we were at like in 1980, but I'd have to go back and double check. But I think all that filters into it as well. And, I find it interesting that Chevrolet was pretty much out to lunch, with the exception of a few places this year.
like I said, they weren't, in my opinion, I don't feel like they were terrible, because you had guys like Kyle Larson and Chase Elliott. Jimmie Johnson won 3 races in the beginning of the year. He faltered off at the end, but still had these teams being competitive.
Right.
I mean, granted, there were weekends where we did say, where are the Chevrolets? But all things considered, it just felt like it was Toyota, Chevy, and then Ford was just way back yonder. At least that's the way some of the Ford drivers are making it seem.
Yeah, and, if you look at Team Penske, and you look at Keselowski and Logano, yeah, they were out to lunch. They were out to lunch, just like they weren't even there.
Especially the 22 team.
Right. But, they would have been in there if they hadn't had an encumbered win.
Right. So then you always start to question, was what they were doing that much of a difference that, once it got taken away?
But don't forget, you had Ford win the Daytona 500.
Yeah. I mean,
Kurt
Ford,
Busch. And
Ryan Blaney won a race.
Ryan Blaney won a race.
Stenhouse won 2 races.
Yep. And look at Kevin Harvick.
Harvick won 2 races, yeah.
And was in contention for the title.
Yes. So it wasn't, I guess it wasn't, when you break it down, it wasn't disastrous.
No.
But
it wasn't what they had been used to.
Right.
Or what they were expected to do.
But I wonder if, again, going back to Toyota, when I guess Toyota kind of threw everybody off, because when you bring a brand new car, and suddenly you're spanking the competition, it makes the competition probably feel a whole lot worse than they probably are.
Oh, yeah.
So
yeah, it's
going to be interesting, again, seeing what happens next year now that Chevrolet has their new car.
Oh, definitely.
I mean, not only does it look amazing, I'm very curious if, as Pat Suey told me, all the work that they've put into it, how quickly they are going to get off to a start next year. I'm going to put you on the spot again, Deb. We'll wrap up with a few more things. From 2017, do you have a good, a bad, an ugly, or do you have anything maybe that stands out? We had, of course, the wayward ambulance at Richmond with Matt Kenseth. We had the seemingly what seemed like 24 hours of Indianapolis. But then we had, of course, there was good. Kurt Busch finally winning a plate race at Daytona, stuff like that. I know I didn't give you much time to think about it, but is there anything that comes to mind from the year while it's still fresh in your mind that you immediately recall back that sticks out, of whether it was races or somebody did something?
Well, the first thing that will always stand out in my mind is Martin Truex Jr.'s championship.
Yes.
And what that team achieved.
And I hope that continues to get the coverage that it deserves.
Yeah, me too. The second thing is Dale Earnhardt Jr. in his final season. And even though that team did not have the season that it had hoped for, he still had a good attitude. He was always upbeat, didn't get down on his team, and I think that's something that you need to remember. Next would be the stage racing and how that has changed the sport and for the better. And it'll be interesting to see or do a comparative analysis of who catches on to what Martin Truex Jr. did,
right,
and will attempt to do in 2018 what he did in 2017. And those are the 3 things at the top of my list. Now, next after that will be when we talk about these drivers coming into manhood. It was quite evident when Chase Elliott confronted Denny Hamlin at Martinsville that Chase Elliott had stepped into manhood.
That was quite a night.
And
for many reasons.
Yes, it was. And when we were talking earlier about the way Kyle Busch handled things, and you look at how Chase handled that situation when people were trying to get him to say stuff about Denny Hamlin, and his own comment was, I just don't have time for him. And there's a way to handle it and get your point across. And that's what we used to do at Scene. And we had a saying at UPI, too, if you can't write about it, write around it. There's a way to say things and get your point across without really looking ugly, stupid, or stupid ugly, whichever way you want to put it.
Speaking of Martinsville real quick, what did you think of when the lights came on that day? You were there. You and I were both there. I don't think it got, with everything, of course, that happened after the race, I feel like it kind of got shuffled into the background. But what did you think of seeing those lights at Martinsville, a place that we all know is very historic, and now it has taken another step on its history?
Another night race and another late night.
I I know. I'm hoping we don't get night races there anytime soon.
Well, I understand why they had to do it. Because
right, of course.
Of the weather, and they're having that race so late in the year.
I like having it as an insurance policy
exactly.
that if we start in the middle of the day, we can work on hopefully finishing it
exactly.
that same day. But,
of course, if they would have Martinsville when they used to have it, it wouldn't be an issue.
Right.
They have it in September when they used to have it.
Yeah, we could have a whole separate podcast on what we would do with the schedule and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
All right, 2 more things for you, Deb. I feel like the second biggest story of 2017, and certainly going into 2018, is Richard Petty Motorsports.
Mm-hmm.
Eric Almirola got hurt, Bubba Wallace gets in the car, and then suddenly, through the late summer months, we're talking about, well, Eric's not going to be back.
Mm-hmm.
Who should get that car? And now Richard Petty Motorsports has, aside from its name and its number, they've completely changed their identity going into 2018. Aligning with Richard Childress, moving on to the Childress campus, switching to Chevrolet. To me, they needed to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Something else I also wrote on Racer.com. They needed to get back to being relevant.
Mm-hmm.
They've been an also-ran for quite some time. So I like the move. I'm keeping my expectations realistic here. RCR, of course, has not set the world on fire. But kudos to both camps for realizing that maybe they'll be stronger together because they both need to do something. Again, RPM really needed to do something. I like the fact that Bubba Wallace is getting a shot. How do you view everything that's happened to RPM this year and what it will be going into next year?
Well, I think that it was the right thing to do. And, I think a lot of people forget that until Richard Petty Motorsports most recently went with Ford, the only time Richard Petty had been with a Ford was in 1969. And the only reason he went then was because Plymouth wouldn't come up with a Superbird.
Right.
And he went over there, and he needed something that could combat the Dodge Daytona, Talladegas, and Mercury Cyclones. But to me, Richard Petty Motorsports going back to Chevrolet was a smart move and is really more conducive to that team's heritage than when it went to Ford. I think moving to the Richard Childress Racing campus is smart for several reasons. One, it puts them right there on the campus with the engine program, the chassis program, the engineers, to where they can just walk across the street or to a building to go with them. And the other thing is, it'll be much easier for Richard Petty to get from his house to Welcome. It won't be that far of a drive coming from Randleman all the way to Mooresville, where the team was located.
Yes,
and so that will also put it closer to his other businesses that he has there in Randleman. So that's easier for him and his family and everything there. So I think overall it's a good move. And since that occurred, I can't help but wonder if that's not the reason that Richard Childress did not bring in a third Cup team to replace Paul Menard leaving to go to the Wood Brothers.
We still haven't heard anything official on that, but I think we can all maybe safely assume that the 27 is no more.
Right. Well, if you go to the Richard Childress Racing website, they only have 2 Cup drivers listed up there.
Right.
And
once again, I know we all like to have official statements from teams and whatnot. We haven't gotten that from RCR, but I think it's safe to assume that the 43 pretty much, even though it's Richard Petty Motorsports, the 43 is pretty much taking over the resources of what the 27 was getting.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an accurate assessment. And I think Andy Petrie coming in there is a really good move as well, because RCR had a lot of success when Andy Petrie was there. And, of course, Dale Earnhardt won his 7th championship with Andy Petrie. So I think having Andy Petrie back in there will be very beneficial to both organizations.
Yeah. Again, it was one of those things where both teams needed to do something. Richard Childress Racing has not been the same since Kevin Harvick left. I mean, Harvick was their breadwinner, so to speak. So they need to do something to get their organization back to being one of the top Chevy teams. And I keep saying it, but Richard Petty Motorsports really needed to do something to be in the headlines for positive reasons and not because Richard is spouting off about Smithfield and things like that. So
yeah, and not only that, too, you had Matt Borland over at RCR for a while in the engineering department. And now Matt is going to be Ty Dillon's crew chief.
A very smart individual.
Oh, yes, he is. And
And Germain Racing, of course, is another alliance with Richard Childress Racing. So it'll be interesting to see what that team does.
Most definitely.
I talked to Ty Dillon actually in Homestead for a podcast, and Ty talked a lot about how they're at that same point where frustration was really starting to get to them as well, because they felt like they started off the year strong. They were building, and then they just kind of fell off. So they have high expectations for themselves as well. So that whole kind of group over there of RCR, Germain, and Petty will probably be one of the big stories I feel like we're all following next year.
Most definitely.
To see if these changes are doing anything. Let's wrap with this. Speaking of 2018, what are you most looking forward to? We're going into a year where there's going to be a lot of change. We don't have a Matt Kenseth. We don't have a Danica Patrick. We don't have a Dale Jr., as we discussed. But we've got all these young guys who are more than capable of being the face of the sport, who are also very successful in their own right. And they're going to keep being successful. Guys like Chase Elliott and Ryan Blaney. Everybody's going to want to see what Bubba Wallace is going to do. Got Chevy with a new car. We've got year 2 of stage racing. I'm sure there's many more things I can keep listing, but it really feels like we're going into kind of a new era. Maybe like it's a new year, of course, but maybe it's kind of a new era for NASCAR in a sense, with lots of different things that are changing. What are some of the initial things on your mind for 2018?
Well, I think it's going to be critical for Chase Elliott to get his first Cup win in 2018.
Oh, absolutely.
I think that's a must. And I think it will be interesting to see how, the other young drivers at Hendrick perform next year, and if Jimmy Johnson and Chad Knaus can overcome the issues they had towards the end of last season. Now it's going to be interesting to see if Eric Amarola's performance changes now that he's going to be over at Stewart-Haas Racing.
I feel like he needs to prove himself.
He does, and particularly that he can come back from the broken back. But now you've got Kurt Busch with a new crew chief, because Tony Gibson's not going to be with Kurt Busch. And so you've got those changes there. This is going to be, I think, a critical year for Ryan Newman. It's going to be, see if Austin Dillon can add to his victory in the 600 and maybe that momentum to be there. To see if Furniture Row Racing can put back-to-back seasons, maybe not back-to-back championships, but successful seasons together.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of changes with the pit road rules and the stage racing.
A pit road will be another thing.
Exactly.
That will be fascinating to watch.
And so I think I'll be curious to see if Ryan Blaney does as well with Penske as he did with the Wood Brothers.
And does Penske kind of shake off the funk a little bit?
Right.
Because you're adding a third car, which, granted, Wood Brothers was kind of their third car already. But now you have... Yeah,
but it wasn't under the same roof, and that makes a big difference.
Exactly. Now you have an actual in-house third car. Plus you're still helping Wood Brothers. So that's 4 cars. But can you shake off the funk of what happened with the 22? Can you make the 2 teams stronger? And then, can you keep Ryan Blaney as fast and successful as he was?
Exactly.
And speaking of critical year, I feel like 2018... another driver, and I'm sure we could list many of them, but the one that comes to mind for me is Trevor Bayne.
Most definitely. And the thing about Trevor that I have wondered, and in noticing his physique, I'm wondering if he's had any more reoccurrences of his MS.
I hadn't thought of that.
Because, that's something that seems to have almost been forgotten, is that he and his sister both have MS. And I just noticed towards the end of last year, it seemed like he'd lost a lot of weight.
That's an interesting point.
I guess I think of it because I have lost one cousin to MS and I have another cousin with MS.
Well, I feel like from my perspective, you get so caught up on, okay, well, he's not running well. You don't think of all what could be contributing factors.
And my ex-fiance's mother had MS.
But I still feel like when it comes to Trevor, because you look at what Ricky did this year, that's why I say for him, are we going to be writing about, was Trevor Bayne a bust? How much longer does he stick around type thing? And he's young, but granted, it's one of those things where you have to start thinking about because...
But again, I think you have to ask where Trevor is concerned, his longevity equating to his MS.
Yeah. That might be something to note down when we go into next year. We start talking at media tour and things like that. Mm-hmm. Well, Deb, I have taken up enough of your time. I'm so glad we got to do this.
Finally, me too.
I'm sure
it's always a pleasure.
We could keep talking for hours and hours.
Oh yes, most definitely.
Normally, when we get together, we cover a lot of ground. So I'm glad that we finally decided to put a microphone to it.
Yes.
Put a bookend on 2017, and once again, I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.